Hello everyone, this is Chris with Fischer Workshops. In this short tutorial, I just wanted to show you what you basically need to get what I would consider professional edge finish on leather with the minimal amount of tools at the least amount of expense. So here I've got a wood slicker. You can pick one of these up from me from $1 to $5 US. This is just a basic edge beveler, and what it does is it trims the corners so you don't have that mushroomed effect after you do your burnishing, and so that'll trim just that edge off so it'll round it for you. And one of these costs about anywhere from $10 to $50 depending on the quality. This one here is just a basic one. I think it's a size 2. I spent like $12 for it. Here's a piece of denim. I use this towards the end, as you'll see, to buff it and give it a nice polish. You can also use canvas as well. Cloth can work as well, but the friction on a stiffer material like this works better for polishing, so I do recommend it. And I've also got some fine grit sandpaper. This is 400 extra fine sandpaper. And I also have a sanding stick with 2 different grades of grit on it. So this is a rougher side and a finer side. I use this just to basically, when I want to get the leather as even as I possibly can. So if you don't have like some kind of Dremel or other sanding device, just one of these sanding sticks will work perfectly. If you're working on a really big project, I would definitely recommend thinking about getting a mechanical device to help you with sanding your edges, because the edges may look even when you adhere them together, but if there's even the slightest bit off, it will affect the outcome of your burnish. So I get a lot of questions about sometimes why is there a crack, or why is there levels between the layers when burnishing, and a lot of that has to do with either one, you don't have a sufficient amount of adhesive between the 2 layers, or the right kind of adhesive. So sometimes people maybe are using a weaker contact cement that just is not very permanent, and over time they'll notice that between the seams it starts to split apart. And that could be current is right after burnishing they start to notice this to happen. Well, that means you don't have a good cohesion between the 2 layers. So what you want to do is use a really powerful contact cement, and I look for contact cements that shoemakers use for their leather working, and the reason is because it's not meant to break apart, it's meant to stay. It's very permanent. And so if I tried to pull these layers apart using the contact cement that I used on it, it would be like trying to rip a piece of leather in half. It's really tight. So you can find that online. There's many brands. Which brand to get is up to you. I try out some because some of the stuff I get is from Asia, and that's where I used to live, so that's kind of what I know. I'm not as familiar with some of the products more available here in the US, but I'm sure a lot of them work just as well. And much cheaper than actually what you get in a leather craft store, but much more effective. So shop around on that and compare, so you don't have to worry about spending too much money on adhesives, but definitely look for something that's used for shoe work, and that might really help. So today what we're going to do is just with these minimal amount of tools, see what the best possible natural edge finish that we can produce. Of course you can use dye or stainless. This one is already finished. If I wanted to, you could take like an empty paint marker like this one here, fill it with black dye. I don't use edge paint at all. There's nothing wrong with edge paint, I just never use it. I just prefer to stain or dye the edges with one of these empty markers. And you can pick up these kind of edge markers at, I know Angelus Paints sells them pretty affordably. I picked this up from a friend, Bob Park. So, you know, they are available online. You can shop around for them, and they work excellent for just filling up with any color of dye that you have and just applying that to your edge. So also over here, I've got hard wax, and a lot of people have been asking me, is it okay to use beeswax on your edges? Well, I know a lot of people do that. I think the beeswax dulls the shine. It may help protect and preserve the edges, but it's too soft. And I really think that it's a much more professional looking, and you get a better result if you're using a really hard wax. This is Columbus wax. I get this from Japan. And again, I used to live in Asia, so that's why a lot of the products that you see that I have on the table here maybe are from it. But I know you can get something similar to this in the US. I just don't know particularly the name. But you can look for something similar. This is just a hard wax. That's why I have a lighter here. You've got to actually heat up the wax. It's so hard it won't rub off onto the edge. So what we do is we first heat it up, apply that to the edge, and then slowly it'll dry up real fast. And so in order to get that wax to really blend into the edge, what I do is I just buff it until the heat from the canvas and the denim causes that wax to work its way into the edge of the leather. And it does an excellent job of protecting the edges and giving them a brilliant shine. So a lot of people may look at your edge and say, wow, what kind of edge paint are you using? But it's not. It's just purely a natural finish, or it's just been dyed. So let's get started, and you can see the results for yourself. Now, the first thing is make sure the adhesive on both, this is 2 pieces of 9-ounce to 10-ounce leather here. So this is fairly thick leather, and I have 2 of them combined. Thick leather is obviously going to be easier to burnish because it's hard, it's thick, and you don't have to be so careful with it. Now, if you're going to be burnishing the edges of something that's like 1 millimeter thick or 2.5 ounce leather, then you're going to have to exercise a little bit more caution with that, because it's really easy to mess up the edges or to stretch the leather when it's wet. And I'll show you what I do later on. But first off, let's look at this. These are already made even, but I do want to sand them still a little bit to get a little bit more of a finer finish. So normally I would start with this rough edge, and you want to make sure that you're not, when you're sanding, you're not tilting it like this or like that, so that this is no longer even and flat. You want to keep it as flat as you possibly can. And I don't need to go over this too many times since I've kind of already got sanded down. You also just really want to make sure that when you feel over this, that there's no contact cement mixed into here, because that contact cement is going to look really messy on the finished burnish. It'll be seen. It'll be really noticeable. You don't want it to be seen at all. So if you look here, you can't see any contact cement at all on this finished side. So we want to get that same result over here. So the reason sometimes you do see the glue come out in the or rub off in the burnish is because you use too much. So use as thin of amount as you can when you're applying it, because you don't need a lot to get that really powerful cohesion between the layers. Then I'm going to go to my finer side and go over it a few times with that until I think, you know, it's got the right texture to it. Okay, it's already starting to get smoother. Lastly, I want to kind of just briefly go over it with this fine grit sandpaper. And I just want to get any extra fiber that's been left on the edge there off. Okay, it feels really smooth and soft now. Now we want to bevel it. I'm just going to use this number 2 beveler. I think this is made by Tandy. And you do need to sharpen these sometimes. If you start to feel it kind of lags when you go, then you might want to strop the back of it and make it a little bit sharper. And go flip it over to the other side here. And you can see it takes like a triangular edge off of that, and that's really important because later on you don't want, when you burnish it. Now some people just go straight to burnishing it. They don't worry about it. You can also take that sandpaper if you really worry about having that perfectly rounded edge and kind of blend it in better. But it doesn't really make a difference on something this thick. Okay, so now we're pretty much ready. I want to make sure I've wiped off any excess fiber that might still be on there. Now this is just water. There are lots of edge finishing products out there, and I'm not giving a review on any of those today. I do know that they all have their goods and bads. They all work. It's just, since I've been doing this, I find, especially if you're starting out, don't spend a lot of money on edge finishing products when water does equally as good a job as anything out there on the market. Sometimes you might, for different products, different situations, find a certain edge finish works better than others. But I would just recommend starting off with water. It works great. Most of the people I know who are professionals in this industry, after years of experience, stick with water. So you're always safe with that. Now this wood slicker has these different size grooves for different thicknesses of leather, and so today I'm just going to use this largest one. So if you can see as I'm coming up and down, this is rounded in here, and it's going to start to burnish and compress the fibers together. There will be a problem because this leather is actually so thick that this rounded point cannot touch all the way to the center. That's no problem. They make these with that in mind. So that's why we have this long part on the end, and we can go over that. You don't want to press too hard that you're actually warping the leather. Your goal is to burnish it. So don't press in too hard, otherwise you're going to have a bumpy, uneven surface, because leather is a softer material and it's not as tough as wood. So every once in a while I'll flip back over to the other side and focus on the edges a little bit. And it doesn't take too long. And oops, and that will happen also. And then just keep repeating and coming back until the surface starts to feel smooth and dry. Okay, it's starting to feel pretty smooth and dry. It still doesn't have that brilliant shine to it yet. It is definitely much better than, obviously after sanding there is some shine to it. But if you compare it with this one, it just looks much more even and smooth in the burnish. The color consistency is kind of balanced throughout the burnish. This one is not, it's speckled. And the reason it's speckled like that is because not all of the fibers on the surface are getting burnished. There are different, I guess, depths to the fiber on the surface, and that's why we're seeing that. So no matter how many times I do this, you're not going to have that consistent color in the burnish. So this is why I see a lot of people do this, especially seasoned leather crafters. They'll take this fine grit sandpaper, especially if they're kind of perfectionists when it comes to their edges, and they'll go over it again. And the good part about this is that the edge has already become harder than it was before because we've already burnished it. So we've compressed all the fibers along this edge. So now we have more of a glass-like finish that we're sanding, and we're going to get a more precise, a smooth sand across the edge going over it the second time. I've seen some people do this with different grits of sandpaper, starting off with like a 400 grit sandpaper, and then moving up from there to 600 and even to 800 over and over again until it's so smooth, it's ridiculous. But I find most of the time with a harder leather, that's not necessary. 400 grit is enough to get almost equal results. So we don't have to repeat that step too many times. Otherwise, some of you might think, oh, this is too much work. It's not really though. But the good part about getting the edges really beautiful is it really increases the value of your product. It makes it look 100 times better. If you don't do the edges nicely, it really cheapens the look of it, unless you just want it to look really simple, which is perfectly fine too. But if you're planning to sell your leather goods, I definitely would recommend going the extra step, and if you have to, sand it once, sand it twice, until you get the results that you're after. So now our burnish is getting more and more even in its consistency and its color. Okay, and what I'm always going to be looking for, because in the leather itself, it may have still some dips and indentations, and if you see that, you can opt to sand it again. Sometimes it's not necessary. This top side, I got perfect results after one sand. This one has been harder for me, and I'd say it's going to take maybe 1 or 2 more times, because there is some deeper areas, but it's not always necessary to get it down so perfectly. But this is just an example. Sometimes if you're after perfection, you may have to, each area that you burnish may have different properties in the leather that you have to work with, and so if you have to sand it down to get it to the place where it's about as good as you can get it, you can do it again. So I'm just going to do this one more time. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and apply our hard wax to it. And basically, you shouldn't see much of a seam, if at all. You'd have to look really hard to tell if there's a seam between these leathers, because the burnish kind of darkens the leather as you go. And normally, it will somewhat hide that seam. Okay, now that we're done with our wood slicker, I'm just going to go over that again with a piece of denim and just apply a little pressure and heat to really buff out that edge. And you'll feel the heat rub off of your hand as you go, and that's kind of your gauge. Once you start to feel it getting warmer and warmer and warmer, then you know you've done it enough. Okay, and that edge looks really, really good. It has a nice glossy shine. It's as smooth as glass to touch, and that's what you want. Now you want to protect this, because over time, if this is a product like a keychain or something like that, if you're putting this in your pocket, it's going to, over time, roughen this area. Now that's unavoidable, but we can do things to preserve it. And ideally, every once in a while, if this is something you really want to last, you can always go reapply a new coat of wax every once in a while and buff it to keep that shine there. So first we'll just heat up the tip of my wax a little bit, and you'll see maybe sometimes some of the residue will flake off from the hard wax onto the surface here, and that's fine. And sometimes not at all. Okay, so what we want to do is start buffing that. Do the same thing. You'll start to feel the heat from this backward and forward motion come off of the denim onto your hand. When you feel that happen, and you know you can stop. Okay, I'm going to do that again. Sometimes once is enough. It just depends on how much wax ends up getting applied to the edge. Okay, so this time we got a lot more wax coming off of the end, maybe because I just got it hotter. So this is going to probably take me longer, which is fine. More wax, better protection. Okay, it looks like all the wax is now blended into the edge, and now the last step is just to bring that buff out, that shine. I'm going to really gently just rub the denim along the edge. Okay, and in the end you should have a very professional, nice looking edge. Here's the other side. Okay, and then again, there's no dye added to this. It's got a nice wax finish on it, so it's well protected. We could put water on it. The water is not going to absorb. So you can see how the water beads off of there. And depending on you, you can apply as much wax as you want. I just think every once in a while, a little bit is enough. And there's still barely a noticeable seam in there. That's a great finish. And this is just a tag I'm going to be putting on a piece of artwork, a large frame. And I've also got some questions from viewers about burnishing the edges of really thin layer. This is what I use in like wallets and things like that. And this is a 2.5 ounce veg tan leather. And so I'll just briefly show you what you can do. I've kind of given up beveling edges on leather this thin. You can. There are edge bevelers that you can buy that are for this purpose. This is a really fine edge beveler. It's a good one. This is made by Barry King, and it can shave off a small amount from the edges. You got to get it right on a corner because it's so thin that this dip here, it won't cut. So here you can see it just cuts a really fine amount off. And you can do that, but I find a straight edge cut does better on wallets when you're using really thin veg tan leather like this. And I also, you know, if you're using calf leather, which is going to be a much softer, more subtle leather, burnishing it is a chore. This is a full side, a large side that's just been cut down to size. So it's a much stiffer leather. I prefer this kind for wallet interiors. Some people like the softer, but you can use the same, just the water. You don't want to apply too much water. This is actually a little bit too much, but this is enough. And what I like to do is just take my glass burnisher or a hard surface and hold it up like that. I don't use, you could use a wood slicker. It's way too risky though from stretching the leather. The goal is not to let the leather stretch. And gently, don't use a lot of force, but just allow the friction to do the work for you. And you got that against that hard surface and that edge. And now I have a nice burnish there on that edge. And you can flip it over because sometimes, because you're holding it against a hard surface, you don't get the backside much. So you do the same. And again, this is my method. Some of you may have a more effective approach to this. I welcome you to share your ideas, your input with us in the comments below. Also, I really do appreciate your questions. It's because of your questions that I prepare to share in this video. So thank you guys for submitting those questions. I also do appreciate your comments and your expertise as well to contribute to our community here on YouTube. And that's all you need to do, and that way you're not stretching out the edges at all, and you get a nice burnish on the end. So if you want to burnish these ends, you can. I recommend doing it that way. In some sense, maybe water is not the most ideal product for really thin leather, because you want something that's going to burnish quickly but also not be as wet as water, because it's easier to stretch. With the harder leather like this, it's not going to do that, but with a softer leather it will. So I would recommend for edges this product. Let me pull it out. And again, sorry guys, a lot of my stuff's from Asia. I now live in the US, but I lived in Asia for so long. This is from Japan. This is Seiwa Tokonol, and I just buy the white, but they have this in brown, black, and other colors. Excellent product for doing the back side of the leather. And you can apply this, this is a really thin coat is enough, so this will last you forever. I've had this bottle here for probably 2 years, and it's still more than half full. And I make a lot of leather goods, so it lasts a long time. And you just put that on the back side, and really fast, it'll flatten out all those fibers and put a nice polish on there for you. It can also be used on edges, but it is a resist. Water is not. So when you burnish an edge with water, even though I've just burnished this, as long as I haven't applied the wax yet, I can apply a stain to the surface and still dye that after burnishing. With this, you're gonna have a hard time with that. So it is a resist, and it doesn't take water once it's been applied, but it's a great product, and I think it might even work more effectively on some edges like this in water, especially if you're worried about controlling the amount of water on the edge. Okay, again, if you have questions and comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful to you.